You may recall that last summer we spent some time walking through the various stories, the faith journeys of each of our participants on our leadership team. Now, when you think about why would a church do this? Why would we provide time on a Sunday morning to highlight the faith story of those on the leadership team? Well, have you ever thought about how God's love necessarily is experienced in the context of your story, of your narrative? It's through the interactions with people who show you his love, who show you his grace, who show you his mercy, who show you his compassion. And so as we hear stories, there's multiple purposes to this. The first purpose is for you to get to know those who are on the leadership team, right? It's important to kind of know who's making some of these decisions, who's giving of their time and their talent and their energy and their passion and their excitement for what God's up to in this church, for all those behind the scenes things, right? It's important to know that. Secondly, though, the hope is that you'll be reflecting on your story, that you'll be thinking about maybe those people who have shown up in your life, that you'll be thinking of maybe ways that your story, the way that God has shown you love, the way that you've learned more about God's character, more of God's goodness, has either, there's parallels maybe to the story that you're hearing, but maybe there's also juxtaposition. Maybe there's things that you bump up against the story and you're like, oh, but that, I had a very, very, very different experience. Well, there's benefit in reflecting on your story. And so that's the hope, is again, it's multiple layered, where the first layer is, again, to get to know those on our leadership team. That second layer is to hopefully be driven back to saying, where have you experienced God? Where has God shown up in your story? Who are the people that you thank God for as highlights, who have given you time and talent, who have poured out their lives so that you've experienced a little bit of God through those relationships? Because again, God necessarily shows up in the context of our stories. We can't get outside of our own head. We can't get outside of our own shoes. We can't get outside of our own narratives. So friends, today we have the opportunity to interact with Mr. Jared Korstanje. Hello.
Hello. I'm sorry, you're going to see me all service long up here.
Yeah, I thought this is kind of the Jared show, maybe poor planning to kind of have you up here. We do have water that's almost empty in case you need to kind of refresh a little bit. But today I also thought it was especially important because coming through pandemic, we haven't always seen all the faces of the people who have been journeying with us. Right, we haven't gotten to know people over the course of meals and potlucks, and we haven't, had people into our homes as much as maybe normal. And so these types of interactions end up being that much more important to get to know the people who have been tracking with us. So just as a bit of a start, why don't you unpack a little bit of growing up? Like, what was the life like for you? Where did you grow up? What was your family like? Tell us a bit about those early years.
Yeah, just to echo what John said, it's because we basically started going to the church during pandemic, just at the sort of beginning of it. So, I think it was a long time before I even saw faces or, I heard names, but, you're trying to weave through it. So it's, I love being on this side of it where I can see and, mostly smiling faces and yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I think he's talking to you, Gary. No, just.
Yeah, so just a little bit about my background. So I grew up basically in Brantford, just down the highway. We moved there when I was about 4 years old. We started going to a church there, and so that's the first time I was introduced to the Warner family, this Warner family. So John's parents were going to the same church, and so John's parents are just amazing, hospitable people, and so when we were new to the church, they became, befriended my parents as a new family, and sort of because our parents were friends, as it goes, John and you're the same age, so you guys play together. So we've been friends for, since we were 4 or 5 years old. So it's just interesting looking back and saying, some of the voices in my life throughout the entire, journey have been, John, like Dr. Aaron Smith, who talked to a few years ago, was a friend growing up. So yeah, it was a great childhood. Do you want me to dig deep?
Yeah, you can unpack a little bit more.
It depends if we want to get out on time or not. But so in Brantford. So my two parents, they may even be watching. They still live in Brantford.
Hi, Casey. Hi, Mama Kay.
So my dad worked a lot of evenings. My dad was as a writer for the newspaper, and so he worked a lot of evenings, a lot of nights. So, most of the week was me, my brother, my mom, and I have great memories because I think I got a lot of my humor from my mom. We.
Can you tell us what a Lori special is? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. Lori is the name of his mom, and she was a bus driver. But tell us about a Lori special.
She drove a bus, and so she. And I remember this from a kid, her saying it many times. So if she comes up to a light and there's a parking lot beside us, we'll just whip through this parking lot, skip the lights, skip all the cars. And for some reason that got coined Lori Special.
A Lori Special.
Yeah. So no, love my mom. We had the same humors. We'd laugh at stuff like that. My dad being a writer, he was always, he was always very thoughtful. And I can remember my dad being, he was always very open to, if he was presented with a new idea, with hearing a story, a new context, he was open to saying, it's not just I believe what I believe and it's nothing will ever change because I figured it out. He was always very open to hearing a story, hearing something, and saying if it's compelling, he would change his mind on that and say, yeah, that's compelling. Let's look more deep into that. So I think from a pretty young age, it was explore, it was challenge, it was not just accept what everyone says as 100% truth, but look into it, dig deep, and really find the truth.
To kind of piggyback on that, Casey, if you are watching, Casey first introduced me to the author Susan Howich. I don't know if anyone knows Susan Howich, but it was in the context of if you want to write better or you want to think better, be introduced with, interact with better writers and better thinkers. And so you have to be challenged by what you're reading and what you're thinking, and that kind of goes to what Jared was saying. He encouraged those around him to also be those that pursued sort of deeper thinking and looking at the world with a broader lens, which is kind of beautiful because he impacted you, but he's also, the influence has rippled out. So as you think about, again, that family of origin, anything else sort of noteworthy about that experience of early home life?
Yeah, I was thinking about, John sort of said, think about your family, think about kind of your past. And I think something that's interesting is that my parents found Jesus as adults. So they didn't come from a big heritage of, church life, or they found Jesus in their 20s as a married couple, kind of through my uncle, kind of inviting them and talking with them. And I kind of remember my dad sort of sharing about how it's like, they fancy themselves, they're pretty smart, intelligent, understand, so they're not going to be drawn into this, drawn into the world where, people are told what to do. And then he said at some point my uncle, he invited them all the time, and one day they said for some reason, they don't know why, they decided to go to church with my uncle and met Jesus there, had an experience where the world was bigger than they thought, and long story short, 40 some odd years later, I'm here, and and I'm sort of, because of those decisions, I'm able to teach my kids about Jesus. So it's just an interesting sort of faith legacy that started at my parents.
A faith legacy that calls out the fallacy that in order to be a person of faith, you got to divorce it from your mind and your intellect, right? There's kind of a fallacy out there in the world that no thoughtful, smart, intellectual person believes in Jesus, right? You may hear that out in the world. Whereas I think what you're describing here is the exact opposite, right? Your parents are people that are thoughtful, and they actually went into it saying, no, you're not going to convince me of this. But they met Jesus and then brought that smart, thoughtful, intellectual kind of approach into their faith journey, which is kind of cool.
Exactly. And then later in life, my dad, he became the religion writer for The Spectator. And so it kind of melds those two worlds together. You're talking about religion, and he could, talk about lots of faiths, but talk about Christianity, talk about Christ in the context of literature and journalism, and you know what I mean. So yeah, I was just impacted by that. Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. So you grew up in a home that your parents were following Jesus. You said they met Jesus in their 20s. Can you tell us about your own journey then with faith and with Jesus? Obviously, again, when you're growing up in that Christian home, it adds certain dynamic. But why don't you unpack that for us?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when we talk about, oh, when was the time you were saved, or when was the time that you made a decision, and even Christine and I were kind of talking about this, and I was trying to look back, and then it's kind of growing up in a household of faith. It was sort of like Jesus was kind of built into the rhythms of what we did. So there wasn't like okay, it's time now, sit down and like, you need to make a decision now. It was built in, the understanding of Jesus' love and the way he's moving in our world and change and his kingdom being here was sort of built into, yeah, kind of the fabric of what our family was. So I think, so starting off early in life, I sort of, yeah, kind of loved Jesus and saw him as an important part of our life. Now I think the interesting thing as we kind of move forward is, like the worldview and the way I think now is obviously radically different than when I was 5, and I think that's okay. I think it's good to say, hey, let's see a faith, let's see it, and then let's actually relate it to our lives now, and not just sit with what I was 5 and say, oh, this is great, but actually continue to push and move. And
I think too, you think of that process of growing up. There's going to be a number of choosing, right? When we think about, again, choosing to follow Jesus, I have chosen to follow Jesus. That once for all time decision that some people frame it as requires a daily choosing to say today, yeah, I may have made a decision. And for you kind of have always grown up with this view. You look at the world, you're like, I know that Jesus loves me. And that's kind of been the water you've swam in. But then even as an adult, daily, you got to say, do I still hold that? Do I still choose to live in the context of this reality?
yeah, and so if I could speak to one, so Christine and I, we were married pretty young, so we talk about how we kind of grew up together. We met as we were late teenagers, but we got married in our early 20s, and we say we kind of grew up together. And there's a point, a number of years ago where kind of Christina came and said, like, what, like, not only just like what do we believe, but like why do we believe it? And it's kind of a big moment of, do we have this faith just because our parents had this faith? Do we have this faith just because it's familiar or it's comfortable, or I can put myself in the in camp and it's, there's some security in that? Or do we believe it because it's true? So and I think it wasn't just a one night conversation and said, great, like,
No, it wasn't. No, that was years and like months and years of that. You guys even unpacked some of that, like with me, that I had the opportunity to see some of that journey. But you guys have been on that journey for
and
certainly not a one night conversation.
It was not a one night conversation. It was let's put everything on the table and let's look at Christ. Let's look at the Bible. Let's look at faith. Let's look at evangelicalism. Let's look at all of this stuff and say, what do we believe? What is good? What brings life? And in some cases, what is not good? And what parts of it can we leave behind that maybe, for 25 years I held on to, and there were some things I said, you know what, this is not good. This is not of love. This is not of Christ. So we can leave that behind. And I haven't arrived. It's not like, oh yeah, now I figured it out. It's still a journey that Christina and I are on, and Christina, she was one of the biggest influences. We've been together for a long time, but she's very thoughtful, and sometimes my natural nature is just kind of to, like, if the waters are calm, let them be calm. You know what I mean? We don't need to kind of rile things up if everything's fine. And Christina's more of a nature. Her nature is, no, like I want to stir it up a bit. I want to be thoughtful. I want to see what's. So she's been amazing in our journey, just to say we need to dig deeper into this. We can't just let the status quo. We don't want to live our whole lives telling our kids, just what's easy or what's comfortable. Let's actually dig in and say what is real, what is truth, what is love. Yeah.
That's really beautiful, and I think serves as a sort of an incredible example where you both inherited faith, but then that process of saying, well, what does it mean to make faith my own? And working through that, I think, is a great example. That's awesome. Now, when you think about your journey, you've unpacked a lot of that for us. Are there any, like, you mentioned that moment of kind of meeting Christina, marrying Christina, that was a pivotal moment. Any other sort of pivotal moments that have kind of helped add texture or definition to your faith journey?
Yeah, like I think that was kind of a, that was one moment of many where we said, let's dig in. I think I've had the, I've the good grace or to have a good friend group like John, like others around me that is, that can say, let's sit down, let's have a good conversation, let's talk about things that are going on in the world, let's actually challenge each other, right? Let's not just accept what we've always thought, but let's really push. And sometimes, like there's uncomfortable conversations, but I think I've had a number of those with John and a number of other friends, like the goods that go here, that just allowed us to continually have our faith shaped and moved like over the last, 15 years. There's just been a number of those points when we say, hey, I've never thought about that. Let's dig into that more.
Right. So highlighting kind of, it's been people, less so like things. So the people that have come across your path in your journey, that through your interactions, your conversations, your mutual pursuit of Christ, and your shared love together, you've kind of had kind of these aha moments as you've kind of moved through faith. I think that's amazing, and I think that's again a great encouragement to participate in the life of church community, not just show up on a Sunday, but to say, how can I kind of weave my life with some of the lives of other people that are on this Jesus journey? Because it is sometimes in those relational moments where things get challenged or pushed or stretched, or we have some of those aha moments where we grow in our faith through the people that God's brought into our lives. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, a lot of people, like, words just aren't enough to affect change, but when you hear stories and when you hear, how Jesus is impacted in a certain way, or how someone's journey has been different than your own, like that's what really affects change. Because you see, it's not just a theoretical, but I'm actually seeing someone who's lived this journey and hearing their story and seeing how, how Jesus has been woven into their story, and how, that's the times I find I change the most, or maybe I'm open to the Spirit the most in those times to like kind of grow and, change the way I'm thinking, continue to, like, I think have a better faith.
Oh, very cool. Now, for some of these people, you're new. They've seen you leading music, but you and your family came and joined the PFC church family during pandemic, during the last couple of years. Could you kind of tell us about why here? How did you make the decision? And unpack that for us. Why is this now your church family?
Yeah. So Christina and I, we were going to church in St. Catharines for, like, since we got married. Love the church, love the community, love what they're doing. So I think just before the pandemic, John began pastoring here. And so he talked to us a little bit about, hey, like, this is where I am, this is the ministry that are going on. And, there was nothing that pushed us away from the church we were going to, but through conversations with John about this community, about the things that are happening, in Welland, in Pelham, and about sort of the opportunities that, that we could be a part of that, like we could be a part of this story and this growing community and the way it's affecting change. I think, I think Christina had a lot of talks about it, and we decided we want to be a part of what's going on here. And, and I think we can be blessed by what's going on, and we can, hopefully add something to this community. And so that's what kind of brought us here. And a year ago, we moved 5 minutes down the road, so that was helpful.
It's interesting when you hear stories of church transition. Usually you'll hear either a push or you'll hear a pull, right? And it just kind of comes out in the story. And sometimes there's a bit of both. But what I hear is that there wasn't a push at all, but it was a pull. There was a draw into this community, which is kind of cool. And I think that's there's also healthy ways to leave. And I know that you didn't get into it, but the story of how you left is actually quite beautiful. You met with the pastor, you kind of mentioned that you're leaving, and you talked through, you don't have issues, you're not angry, and kind of you were kind of blessed out the door a little bit. So that's kind of a cool story of transition. And it's a reminder that, again, the formation and the development that you received in that church, now you are who you are to be able to serve in the context of this church. And as we joked about earlier, it's been a little bit of the Korstanje show today with Jared and Christina leading worship, and now you sharing your story. So clearly, again, we've experienced your skill and the talent and the passion that you bring to worship leading, and now you're here because you've recently accepted the invitation to serve on the board, and so now you're serving in that role. I know this is a new role, but can you kind of think about what it's been like to serve, maybe worship, but what are you excited about in terms of serving in the context of PFC?
Yeah, well, I still have a lot to learn. Nancy and Bobby and Jan and Gary, like, it's kind of my first board experience. So if I talk to that specifically, I was happy to be a part of it, and I thought, okay, so Christine and I were committed to this church, and we want to be all in, and we want to help what Jesus is doing in this community. And so, when the opportunity was there, and it's like to be a part of the board wise, even though I have a lot to learn still. I said, yeah, I'd like to be a part of it, and because of the things in the past that PFC has done so well, I said, I think I can be a part, and I think I can continue to kind of grow what has been done for like 230 years here or something, hundreds of years of legacy here. I think it's a great legacy, and I think I'm happy that I can be a part of it, and I can hopefully add some value to kind of what's going on. And I think kind of my passions and kind of lie with helping people, because Jesus talks so much about helping people on the margins, right? And PFC has done a lot of that with Open Arms missions and a few things, like even the baby bottle drive. It's helping people on the margins, and I think that's important to me. And I think it was important to Jesus, and it's obviously important to this church. So I just love the ministries that are going on here, and I love that I can be a part of it.
Very cool. Absolutely, that makes sense. Now, just as we think about sort of closing thoughts or comments, is there anything that you would like to share with just as a kind of final kind of discourse here with the church family?
I was also happy that when we came here that Christina's parents have also joined us here.
Hey, Ozzy, Doris, great to have you with us.
That was actually a big talking point, is that we loved going to church and ministering with our family, and I think that's important. And so that was one talking point that we said, coming here, we're leaving some of that, which is so important. So I feel very grateful that my in-laws are here.
Karen, is that a question? Yeah. Okay.
Sure. So I'm a paramedic in Niagara. So specifically, I work on a team that it's myself and a mental health nurse, that we go to 911 calls that are specifically sort of mental health in nature or involve substance use disorders or things specifically to that. So I was also pretty involved in downtown St. Catharines, helping to get the consumption treatment site started, which gives people, it gives people who are literally at the farthest margin. They're living on the street, they're using substances daily. It gives them a safe place to be, that we can befriend them, we can offer them services, we can, if they're able to make a decision at some point, that we are there and we are a friendly face to help them make those changes. So that's kind of my day job. That's work sometimes at night.
I hear you talking, and clearly my life is very different. I hear. It sounds like you're kind of on the front lines, frontline worker, obviously, as we've heard lots about through the pandemic. But you're dealing with some fairly complex situations that you almost have to apply wisdom and thoughtfulness and your experience and your training to in real time. It sounds like a fairly, somewhat fast-paced, but again, you're dealing with some of the complexity of life, some of the most complex situations that most of us don't actually have to wrestle with day by day, but that's what you face every day.
Yeah, it shows, and especially through the pandemic, there's a lot of hurting in society, there's a lot of brokenness, and so what we do is, we see people when they're literally in that crisis. So when there's so much hurting, and in that moment where actually someone's called out for help, it could be life or death kind of thing. It lets me be in that situation and talk with them and try to say, let's get you on a trajectory going upwards rather than letting you kind of keep spiraling. So.
Oh, that's important. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. That's a great clarifying question. There was one time where we were driving, and Jared's like, I got a song I got to play for you. And he put in the CD, and he said, I think it was track 8. Put it forward to track 8. And the song was Keith Green, and he was singing about the sheep and the goats. Does anybody remember that song? Yeah, Terry and Dar, Ozzy and Doris. Can you talk about that moment a little bit, and just like maybe what has that song, that passage of scripture kind of meant in your life?
Yeah, there's the sheep and the goats. So that's it's a popular Keith Green song, but it comes out of a passage in Matthew. Yeah, I think that whenever that was years ago, I think that was important when I'm in kind of my faith journey, because that passage, Jesus speaks specifically to like the way that we are separated is how we treat people. It is not, a complex set of theologies and hermeneutics, but it's, if we get down to the base, is like, how are you treating the least of these, right? The people on the margins, the people who aren't accepted, or the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. How are you treating these people? And that's the way you treat them is the way you're treating Christ. And I think that was one of those moments where it's just not all, a broad theological framework that's going to, make me part of the kingdom, but it is how are we treating our neighbor or our enemy?
Yeah, and it's just that stark reminder that following Jesus, yes, is about truth, but if it doesn't lead with love, you're actually not following Jesus, right? You'll know that you're my disciples by the way that you love. By the way that you love, by the way that you reach out to the marginalized, those that are sick, those that are in prison, those that are naked, those that are thirsty, all of that sort of thing.
And I think an important thing that I've kind of been learning through that idea is that if you're loving someone with an agenda, is that love? If someone needs food and I feed them, that is what they needed at the moment. I don't feed them and then tie it back to, also you have to now do this, or whatever. You know what I mean? You have to now listen to my sermon, or you have to read this track. Sometimes love, the way Jesus expressed it, just needs to literally be that. It needs to be just love.
Yeah, that's powerful. Awesome. Well, Jared, thanks so much for coming and sharing with us, and just being a part of this church family. I'm certainly excited, and I don't want to say sorry too, but you guys may have noticed, some of you who have been watching, my kids play with their kids. Is that dynamic Jared described about he and I kind of being forced together? Well, they're stuck as well, because their parents are friends, so they see each other, and they're going to be stuck being friends as well. But yeah, it's great.
And also Christina is far more eloquent than I am, so if you want to have further conversations, you know what I mean? But just, yeah, if we haven't had a chance to talk or to meet, and just any time, yeah, talk with us. We might be running after the kids, but yeah, we want to get to know, everyone in this community a bit better, and yeah, hopefully we can.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jared. Now, friends, I hope that as Jared and Christina lead us in this next song, I hope that you have an opportunity to think about your own story. That you have an opportunity to think about the way that God has met you in the midst of your own life, your day-to-day circumstances. I want to encourage you to actually think about those people that played an important role in your faith journey. Who was it that first shared the love of Jesus with you? How did that impact? What are some of the moments in your journey that are kind of those milestone moments where you're like, man, things changed after this event or this person or this conversation or this thing. It's actually super healthy to reflect on some of this and to work it through and to recognize that God has met you in the context of your own story. It matters. It matters. Friends, let's worship together.